So Prop 314, voters overwhelmingly went to the polls and voted to allow local law enforcement agencies to enforce, in other words, to enforce federal immigration law. But there's a caveat here because 314 is tied directly to another law, a Texas law that's tied up in the courts right now. Can you explain a little bit about that and kind of the limbo we're facing?
First of all, Senate 314, Proposition 314 is not just about immigration. It is tied with a fentanyl law, and this created a lot of confusion with voters. They thought they were voting against fentanyl, which, is, a logical reaction. And there's actually a law in Arizona that says you can't have two unrelated proposals on the same ballot proposition. There was an attempt to sever the two. A judge in Arizona overruled that. So it went forward as a law against fentanyl with some vague language in it about immigration. So I think this resulted, first of all, in confusion amongst voters. They thought they were voting against a dangerous drug, but they were also voting for some vague language about immigration. Now, as to the connection with Senate Bill 4 in Texas, there is actually a clause in the wording for Proposition 314 that says it does not take effect, and it may never take effect. It does not take effect until the federal courts rule on a similar law in Texas called Senate Bill 4. So there is no start date for Proposition 314, and this creates another problem. The opponents of Proposition 314 rightfully pointed out that the courts have already ruled on a similar law called Senate Bill 1070 that took effect 10 years ago, 14 years ago in 2010 in Arizona. And the courts said that law is unconstitutional because it's not the function of local law enforcement to play the part of a federal immigration officer. And if I were to enforce that, as a sheriff tried to do with Senate Bill 1070, I would be found in contempt of court. Joe Arpaio, a sheriff in Maricopa County, attempted to enforce Senate Bill 1070 after the courts had ruled it unconstitutional, and he was convicted and found in contempt of court for doing that. So there's a lot of potential problems, and there's some others I could mention as well.
What is your main gripe, if you will, your main opposition to Proposition 314, to the specific part that would allow, that would make illegally crossing the border at any other point except at a port of entry a state crime? What do you feel is your main issue with that?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, there's no funding in this bill. It would take my officers off their core mission, which is twofold. Our core mission is to deal with violent crime and property crime. So violent crime is things like assault and homicide. Property crime is things like fraud, theft, burglary. That's our core mission. And we're a very small sheriff's office. We're the smallest of 15 counties in Arizona, but we have the largest ports of entry with Mexico, the largest contact with Mexico. So we have, I only have 40 sworn officers to cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That includes vacation days, sick days, training days. So we're stretched very thin, and we're outnumbered 30-1 by the federal officers. So this is rightfully a federal issue. There's 30 federal officers doing the immigration function for every one officer that I have. So first of all, it takes us away from our core mission. Second of all, there's no funding. I run a jail down here, so these would become state prisoners. They wouldn't be a federal prisoner under a federal violation. They would be under a state violation. There's no, like, if a federal agency puts a prisoner in my jail, I get reimbursed a per diem rate because they're on federal charges, but they're being held in my jail. There would be no funding for this if any prisoners that came in from my agency or a police department or the highway patrol or any other state agency that put people in my jail under this law. Also, the prosecutors, the county attorney's offices have been opposed to this because there's no funding for them to have additional prosecutors, and the court system and all the support services like the Arizona Department of Correction, the Arizona prison system. These would become, if convicted, state prisoners. They wouldn't go to a federal prison like the federal prison on Wilmot Road in Tucson. They would go to the State Department of Corrections. There's no funding for them or for state probation officers or parole officers. So that's one of the other big issues, is there's no funding for this. It would take me off my core mission, and there's no embedded funding in Proposition 314 to actually pay for all the state services that would be required.
As I understand it, in the middle of last month, the Arizona Sheriff's Association made a request to lawmakers to, I guess, include about $100 million in the next 2 years funding for state agencies to help with the enforcement of Prop 314 if it were to ever become law. But I read in an article that in that same funding request, Republican lawmakers decided to withhold $250,000 from Santa Cruz County because you voiced opposition to 314. Is that correct?
There are two completely separate
Okay.
issues. There's an organization called the Grand Canyon Institute that estimated it would cost over $300 million for all aspects of enforcing Proposition 314. None of that has been budgeted. Now, every year there has been funding related to border security, and Santa Cruz County has always gotten a piece of that. It's in the scheme of budgets, it's not a big amount. It's $250,000, so $250,000, and everything we do is related to the border. So we've used that money for our radio systems, for vehicles, for everything to do with the functioning of our office, because, like I said, we have the largest ports of entry with Mexico in county. So every year, that's nothing new. That's not related to Proposition 314. That funding has always been there, and we've always gotten it. Now, this year, as far as that funding goes, the Arizona Department of Public Safety, which includes the Highway Patrol, they're the ones that recommend to the legislature how that money is divvied up. And they, along with the Arizona Sheriff's Association, recommended that 3 border counties receive that money, including Santa Cruz County, and 3 non-border counties, which I don't understand why non-border counties would be receiving that. And then, as kind of a political stunt, Senator Kavanaugh in the state legislature, who was the chairman of the committee that was deciding on that funding, decided to go against what's been done every year and to deny Santa Cruz County the funding, because I had said that there are legal problems with Proposition 314. The same reason the courts ruled that Senate Bill 1070 14 years ago was illegal and could not be enforced. You have the exact same issues this year. And I also made the point that it's not going to take effect until Senate Bill 4 in Texas is decided. There's fine print in Proposition 314 that says this state law in Arizona. It's kind of weird to put a clause in there that says the courts have to decide on another law in Texas before this would take effect. So there's no start date. Nobody can enforce this. Senator Kavanaugh was grandstanding and saying, I'm not going to give this to Hathaway because he said he's opposed to Proposition 314. And, it's like, well, nobody else is going to enforce Proposition 314 either. It's not like it had a start date on January 1st of 2025. There is no start date. It would take effect if the courts ever rule favorably on it. So the other counties that are receiving this money also will not use it to support Proposition 314. But, there's other reasons that I'm opposed to this law. If I could touch briefly on some of the philosophical reasons, like my city, Nogales, Arizona, which is the county seat for my county, is 95% Hispanic. That's the demographics of this city. It's not due to some, quote unquote invasion. If you look at the demographics 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, it was always the same. This used to be part of Mexico. Before that, it was part of Spain. So I'm not about to go ask practically every single person in Nogales, Arizona to show me your papers. to prove you're here legally, because practically everybody is Hispanic. They have Hispanic physical characteristics. They speak Spanish. They have Hispanic last names like Martinez or Rodriguez, Hernandez. So just because they're Hispanic, I'm not going to do racial profiling on them and say, hey, show me your papers and prove to me that you're here legally.
Um, but but as I understand it, this is specifically those who cross the border illegally. But you're saying that it may look to an outsider that much of your county, because of they're of Hispanic descent, may there could be an argument to be made, however falsely, that they may have crossed the border illegally. Is that correct?
Well, our city, Nogales, Arizona, the primary city here, is a sister city with Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, one city divided by the border. The courts have ruled on a concept called extended border search authority that says when officers are working immigration details, when they're working on immigration charges, if you're within 100 miles of the border, it's considered to have a nexus to the border. So I'm sure if Proposition 314 went into effect, there would be that same logic that you have houses right up against the fence in Nogales, Arizona. If somebody's traveling away from Nogales, Arizona, that there would be articulated a nexus to the border, to Mexico's, because the federal courts have already ruled on that immigration enforcement officers can treat any area within 100 miles of the border as a border search, as related to the border. So that's already in effect as far as federal officers, where they don't have to show that they visibly saw somebody cross the border.
Sheriff Hathaway, do you think Prop 314 will ever take effect in Arizona?
I don't think so, because when the courts look at it, the federal courts, they always look at legal precedent. There is already case law on this, where the federal courts have already spoken in regards to Senate Bill 1070 and saying, no, this is unconstitutional. This is not a mandate for, this is a federal issue. This is in the purview and the venue and the domain of the federal government to do this. So they would have to go against previous rulings. That's why before this was passed, I was telling people this is an illegal law. Illegal. The courts have already spoken. There's already case law on this issue. So unless the courts reverse course, it is already illegal in the federal system has already ruled this to be illegal. Unless they reverse course, it will still be illegal. So